All right, how's it going, y'all? So it is October of 2024 and ransomware is still rampant. And this tutorial is going to really focus on very basic things you can do with BTRFS snapshots on a Synology NAS to protect yourself from 95% of ransomware cases. This is that ransomware case where somebody gets a virus on their computer and it encrypts all the files on the shared file server, which in this case is on the NAS, or encrypts something like the Windows domain controller, or who knows what else. We're going to go over in this tutorial how to use snapshots to really protect yourself from pretty much all of that. And it's going to be non-disruptive to how you're currently using the NAS. That's a really nice thing about using snapshots. This exact same feature is available also on any file systems that use ZFS, and they really allow you to basically have a point-in-time restore for incredibly low cost. When I say cost, I mean storage cost. Both BTRFS and ZFS, BTRFS is the file system Synology uses, do a thing called copy on write. And I'm not going to go super in depth on how that works, but they both allow you to take a snapshot, a point-in-time memory of exactly what every single file looked like when that snapshot was taken for almost free computationally. Then they allow you to roll back or even view those previous versions almost instantaneously. And the only thing it costs you in terms of space is essentially like a recycling bin. If you delete a 10 gigabyte file and you keep snapshots for 30 days, well, once you delete that 10 gigabyte file, it's going to be held in that snapshot for 30 days, and now you're not going to get that 10 gigabytes of space back for 30 days. But you've got 30 days to undo it. So that's my really brief primer on how snapshots work, because a lot of people ask me those questions, and I really want to get this out there because this is the number one thing you can do to prevent ransomware. It is incredibly easy, it does not have a negative effect on your NAS, and it is useful for so much more things than just ransomware. And we're going to go over all of that in this tutorial. We're also going to talk about how you can actually use immutable snapshots to take this to an even further level, and how you can also use this if you're only using the NAS as a backup for like Time Machine, Hyper Backup, Active Backup for Business, or anything like that, where you can have that same functionality. And I do want to mention right at the start of this video that this does require you to have a NAS with BTRFS. If you install an ext4 on your NAS, you're not going to be able to use snapshots, unfortunately, so I want to get that out of the way right at the beginning here. So this video is going to be very much focused on ransomware and snapshots, and this is really making sure that no matter what happens, you can recover from it. I am going to give 4 really quick, just super basic settings, just because I feel like I have to give them anytime I do a good security video, that are incredibly easy and you should check right now and make sure you've got set up. So after I do my intro, I'm going to lead off with those 4 really quick, rapid fire, hey, check this, check this, check this, before we go forward. And then we're actually going to go into setting up snapshots and actually using them and really understanding how they work and how they can protect you. But before we go over all that, I really want to talk about what ransomware is, because there are many types of it. Ransomware really has 2 different phases. There is encrypting your files and making it so that you have to pay them to get your files back. And that is really what we're going to be covering here, because that is what affects most home users, small businesses, and things like that. The people extorting these businesses do not have the in-depth research to figure out exactly what every single file is and build an upload path for smaller companies and things like that. So that is the primary phase we're going to be talking about. Then the second phase of ransomware that this will not be helping us against is where they actually use your files against you. So say you are Microsoft, and in this ransomware, they actually get the entire source code for Windows. There is a form of ransomware extortion where they would say, unless you pay us $1 million, we're going to post the source code of Windows online. So that is the extortion side of, hey, if you don't pay us, we're going to release it. That is much harder to actually fight against. What you can really make sure on your NAS is you can really make sure that your files will be recoverable pretty much no matter what happens. And that's really what we're going to focus on. That other side of ransomware, what you really should do to protect yourself is educate your users, because the most common way that happens is people using really dumb passwords as well as clicking links in emails, because that is your biggest threat surface, is always going to be your users for the most part. But we're really going to focus on the rest of this video, making sure that if a user does get a virus on their computer, we can recover from it very easily. But first, I'd like to take a quick break to thank the sponsor of today's video, DeleteMe. Did you know that your personal data is sold online by data brokers? You have the right to stay private and protect your personal data. Data brokers are corporations that collect a huge amount of personal information, like phone numbers, addresses, and even your relatives, from a variety of sources, like government public records and social media. They then aggregate this information into listings or profiles and then sell it to either other data brokers or other organizations who have an interest in your private data. Having this information out there increases the risk of being a target of identity theft, which has been made easier by the prevalence of personal information online. And that's where DeleteMe comes in. DeleteMe can help protect you from the risks of identity theft by removing your personal data from hundreds of data brokers online. They will then provide a privacy report showing what data they were able to find and remove, and will continue to monitor and repeat removals as required. I personally have used DeleteMe and recommend it to help protect your personal information. Get 20% off DeleteMe US customer plans when you go to joindeleteme.com/Rex and use promo code REX at checkout. That is code REX at joindeleteme.com/Rex. Thanks again to DeleteMe for sponsoring today's video. Now back to the video. All right, so let's talk about how these crypto viruses work. So it's actually very simple and very effective. So what will happen is they will send a phishing link. They will have a bad website where it downloads a virus somehow to a user's computer. It is very rare that the NAS itself ever gets targeted, but in that case, we do have immutable snapshots that we're going to talk about in the second half of this video. But in the vast majority of cases, a user clicks a link and somehow downloads software that has a virus on it. What that virus does is it kind of sits and it waits. It will wait and it will encrypt very rarely used files in the background, slowly, on any drives that it has access to. And in a regular workplace or home environment, that probably is a file server as well, where everybody's got shared storage. That virus has the permission of that user. So they've got access to the NAS, it can start encrypting files in the NAS, and the very advanced ones will actually start with files that are very rarely used. So it will go in the background and it'll start, because if it starts with files that are very rarely used, it'll be longer and longer before anybody notices. So all the while it is encrypting these files, and what it's doing is it is not deleting the files, because deletes show up in a recycling bin. Instead, it is simply modifying the file, just like saving any Word document does, except now, instead of actually being a Word document, it is now an encrypted file. And the only way to decrypt it is to use the private key that the attackers have on their server. That's the problem with encryption. It is really easy to do really good encryption that you're not going to be able to break. So all the while, your files are getting encrypted. And because they're not actually deletes, even if you have a recycling bin, they're never going to show up in that recycling bin. And so what will happen is eventually you'll either notice, or the entire file system will be encrypted, and then you'll get a message somewhere on there that says, pay X, Y, and Z amount of Bitcoin to this address, or all your files are toast. And because of the way that this works, there's not an easy way to go back to it if you're using something just like an external hard drive and you don't have any versioning on there. And so this is an incredibly common attack, and the problem is it's incredibly easy to automate. And so for the last 5 years, it's been getting more and more prevalent, because now there is a very easy way that they can reach thousands of people rather than these one-off extortion attacks like we used to see back in the day. Really, now these are much more sophisticated attacks. And so that is exactly how a crypto virus works. There are ways to detect it. Synology Active Insight does have a way of detecting these. And so if they're common viruses, it'll say, hey, I see the same kind of zip setup that I see with encryption. Let me throw a warning to the user. But in general, it's very hard for NAS to really detect without doing in-depth research on exactly what every user is doing, because things like zipping a file will look very, very, very similar to encrypting it. That's because they're pretty much the same process. An encrypted zip file is not really that different from an encrypted file to a NAS, which is just hosting the files. So for the most part, what we're going to do here is we're going to make sure that if this happens to you or your business, that you can recover from it and recover from it really quickly. This does not replace having backups. Now, obviously, you could also just recover your files from a backup. You really should have a backup. Nothing I'm doing in this video takes the place of a true backup, but people don't have backups. I get it. And the other thing is, this does not require downloading terabytes of data. What we're going to be able to do is if this happens to you, you are actually going to be able to restore your files within 5 minutes. It is absolutely awesome, and so it allows you to get back up and running far faster than any backup solution out there. Because of the way snapshots work, all the files are there exactly as you want them. All we have to do is update a very small pointer to say exactly how we want it. And we're going to cover all that in this video. We're going to go ahead and log into my DS923 that I use as a demo for all of these videos. And before we actually get started setting up these snapshots and going over all that, as promised, there are 4 really quick tips that I want you to check right now and make sure are set up on your system because they are incredibly easy. All of these are going to be assuming you're running DSM 7.2 or later. Okay, so the first one, and actually all of them are in Control Panel. First thing to double check, make sure that this account labeled admin is disabled. That is the number one thing, is having a disabled admin account, because this account has extra privileges and is really the internal system account. And everybody knows that there is an account labeled admin, so make sure it's deactivated. Your screen should look just like this, admin and guest both deactivated. Then go into security, account, and make sure you've enabled adaptive MFA. This is not full-blown 2-factor authentication, but it's about 90% as good at 5% the headache. Adaptive MFA is basically how your bank accounts work. Essentially, if an admin signs in from outside the local network, from a new computer, it will email you a code. The nice thing is it uses Synology's email servers and not your own email server. And so this is something that pretty much everybody can implement without any big deal whatsoever. And while you're at it, also enable account protection and really keep it at these default settings right here. 5 within 1 minute, 30 minutes, 10 within 1 minute, 30 minutes. Account protection is similar to auto block that we're going to talk about in a second here. And this just allows you to be able to block people who have thousands of IP addresses from trying the same username. So if you had the admin account enabled and there was a botnet of 100,000 IP addresses all trying the user admin, essentially the admin account would be locked out for 30 minutes so that even if a new IP address tried to sign in with it, it's still locked out. And so that helps prevent massive botnets from being able to brute force their way into your NAS. Then, as I said earlier, enable auto block, 10 within 5 minutes and expire after 1 day. People are always trying to make this more restrictive than it needs to be. 10 attempts within 5 minutes is enough to make sure that nobody can brute force their way into your NAS within about 1 million years. And anything more restrictive is not actually really helping you from a security perspective, because if an attacker knows your password, they're going to try once an hour until they get in. If they don't know your password, it's going to take over 1 million years with these settings. So it's not something you need to worry about having like, 2 attempts within 5 minutes. Just leave it at this and have that unblock after 1 day. That way, if you're on vacation, mess up, lock yourself out, you can still get back in the next day, and it doesn't really hurt you too much. That also keeps the block list from filling up. If you've got like SFTP open and you're constantly blocking SSH attempts, the block list can actually start to fill up, and that is not something you want to do. So make sure to have that unblock after a certain number of days. I say 1 day because honestly, as I said, we're talking about millions of years here before anybody's able to brute force their way in. Then finally, this will help with ransomware as well. Have a email notification turned on. This doesn't just protect you from ransomware, it also just protects you from, oops, something's going wrong and I find out. Ever since DSM 7.2 came out, Synology has a built-in mail server that uses Synology's mail server rather than your mail server, which means that you don't have to worry about Gmail kicking you out or anything like that. Basically, it'll send whoever's Synology.com account is hooked up to this an email. And so those are my 4 things to make sure you set up. We're not going super in depth in this video, but I really just try to make sure that everybody's got these settings because it is critical to making sure your NAS is running well. And none of these things have a negative effect on your daily life using the NAS, and you won't even notice, and it will be that much more secure. All right, so now with all that out of the way, let's go in and let's set up BTRFS snapshots to protect ourselves from ransomware. And for the first part of this, we're going to basically assume that you are using the NAS as your primary file server, right? You're an office, you're a home user. Basically, everybody maps the drive via SMB, uses Synology Drive, whatever. And you want to be able to recover from any one of your users getting a virus on their computer. And this is just so much more useful than just ransomware. This also means that if somebody in the office accidentally saves over somebody else's really important Excel document, it's a 2-second undo. It also means that if you're running a script that should be backing up a drive to another place and it accidentally deletes all the files in the destination on the NAS, it's a 2-second fix. I cannot overstate how easy these are to use and how useful they are in cases where something goes really wrong. The amount of times I'm on a call with somebody who goes, everything's broken, I messed up, I was doing this, and this, Google just deleted all my files or whatever, and we are able to get it back in 2 seconds is remarkable. This is absolutely something that you should not skip over, even if you're not worried about ransomware, because there's so much power underneath this, and you're going to forget about them until you need them, and then they are there and they can be an absolute lifesaver. Okay, so now let's go ahead and start off with those snapshots for protecting your NAS as a file server. In the next section, we're going to talk about how to use snapshots to protect your NAS if it's running backups. Say you're a business that runs everything on a Windows domain controller, snapshots can still protect you because you can actually use Active Backup for Business and things like that to actually back up that file server and still protect your files just like that. All right, so now let's go in, and the very first thing we need, as I said earlier in this video, is we need to make sure our volume is BTRFS. So right here, my volume is BTRFS. If this says ext4, unfortunately, you're not going to be able to do this. There's no 2 ways around it. BTRFS or ZFS are required to set up snapshots. So if you're running TrueNAS, you can do the exact same thing here, just with a different user interface, obviously. So if you've got BTRFS, what we can do is we can go into the package center, and all we got to do is type in snapshots. And go ahead and install snapshots, and then it's going to ask you to install a second package called snapshot replication. One part of it is the local snapshot, and then the other part of it is the replication, sending it to a new destination. So go ahead and install that. And we'll go ahead and open it up right here. If you've opened up for the very first time, you will not see any restore points or any saves like this. I use this as test bench and I've already set it up on all the folders, but this right here is what your NAS will look like when you first open up snapshot replication. And what we'll see right here is under all of our snapshots, we see every single one of our shared folders. So snapshots are done on a shared folder level. You can't take a snapshot of the entire volume, unfortunately, and you also cannot take a snapshot of a subfolder. So if we had a folder within management that we wanted to have extra snapshots of or something, you cannot do that. Snapshots are only done on the shared folder level. That is the exact level it's done, or on LUN, but we're not going to talk about it here. Quick summation, you can do it. It's just when you're using iSCSI LUN, it's a whole different process, and use the LUN tab. Okay, so now we are in the snapshot tab, and this is where we can control all of our snapshot settings. One other really important thing to note, as time goes on, when you create new shared folders for X, Y, and Z reason, make sure to come back in here and add the same snapshots, because unfortunately, you have to add them to each shared folder. So what we can do right here is we can control all of our snapshot settings from right here, and you can shift select to actually edit multiple. The way I normally start, and this is literally the first thing I do anytime I get on a call with a client, is I download snapshots and I go ahead and I take a snapshot of every single folder that does not have versions of itself, because it is protection for me as well. If I'm on a call with a client, we're talking through, we're cleaning up some stuff, we're moving files around, and I delete the wrong file, snapshots are kind of my failsafe. I know that if anything happens, I can undo it as long as I've not deleted the shared folder itself. So snapshots are really powerful for that as well. What we want to do is we're going to select all of our shared folders by hitting the very bottom one and shift clicking the very top one. That will select all. And then what we want to do is we want to exclude any files that have their own versions of themselves. Think Time Machine, Active Backup for Business, Hyper Backup Destination, or anything like that. Anything that is doing its own versioning, you want to exclude out of this. We still can take snapshots of them because they are still really useful for that ransomware protection, but we're going to have a much more lenient snapshot schedule. And so we're not going to take them hourly like I'm about to show, but we're going to maybe take them weekly and keep them for a shorter amount of time. That's because when you are taking snapshots of something that has its own versions, you can end up taking a lot more space than you expect versus a file system like this, where people are not massively rewriting entire sections of the file tree all the time. So that's why we're going to uncheck any ones that have their own versions, and we'll come back to them in the second part of this video. And so once we've selected them, we're just going to go into settings, and we're going to go ahead and edit our snapshot schedule. What we'll do is we'll say enable the schedule, and now we get to choose what our snapshot frequency is. And generally what I recommend doing is setting it every day. Start it at maybe like 6 a.m. And then for frequency, 1 or 2 hours. If you're looking for really fast volume usage and you really want to have a lot of ability to roll back, you can even do it up to every 5 minutes. But in general, every hour balances very little overhead with being able to restore often. And then maybe end it whenever people are off work. If people are constantly using it, it's totally fine to leave this running 24/7, but this is a great way of setting up kind of an office file server. And so what this is going to do is this is going to tell the NAS to set up a schedule to take a snapshot between 6 and 8 p.m. every hour. And this allows us to basically have like a restore point. So what this will actually mean in practice is if you're working on a Word document and you're making some changes and you accidentally save over something, delete a bunch of stuff, and you're like, man, I wish I could go back to how that file was 2 hours ago, you'll be able to have hourly granularity. So that is how that works. For the vast majority of users, this will have no effect, no difference than taking them once a day. That's because the file system is really smart. So people are often worried that snapshots are taking up a ton of space. They are not. Whenever you're thinking about snapshots, really think of them like a recycling bin. If you have a recycling bin that empties itself after 30 days, when you delete a 10 gigabyte file, that recycling bin is now taking up 10 gigabytes of space for 30 days. Snapshots work the exact same way. If I delete a 10 gigabyte file, it doesn't matter if it's referenced in 50 snapshots or 1 snapshot a day, it is going to take up those 10 gigabytes of space for 30 days, depending on our retention policies. So that is my quick piece there. People are often very concerned that it's doubling the space. It is not. It is taking up the exact same amount of space that a recycling bin would. Now, this is also where we can enable immutable snapshots if we want to. Immutable snapshots are very useful for ultimate ransomware protection, where your NAS itself is compromised or your account on the NAS is compromised. An immutable snapshot prevents you as the administrator from being able to remove these snapshots or delete that sub-volume, even if you try to. This is a double-edged sword. It means that no matter what happens, your NAS will not remove these snapshots for a prescribed period of time. And by the way, this actually uses its own clock. So if you try to just change the date string on it, these immutable snapshots don't expire. Literally, if you turn the NAS off, the clock stops. So you're not able to spoof it, at least any way I've found. But what this allows you to do is make sure that no matter what happens, snapshots cannot be removed for 7 days. Now, that may sound great, but it also restricts you from being able to delete the shared folder, format the volume, or if somebody messes up, and I very often see this in video production houses, where if somebody messes up and accidentally copies 20 terabytes of data to the NAS and you're at 90% full, there's no way to get that data off the NAS for 7 days if we enable immutable snapshots. So my really quick summary is, don't enable immutable snapshots yet. Get your NAS set up, make sure everything's good, get used to snapshots, and then enable immutable snapshots if you want to. It's really up to you, and we'll talk about it a little bit later on, but for now, we are not going to enable those immutable snapshots. So for the most part, the snapshot schedule on this page does not actually have a very large impact as to how much space these snapshots are actually going to take up. That's because snapshots only take up space when files change. So if you take a snapshot every 5 minutes of a file that never changes, those snapshots take up 0 space. What does actually really control how much space snapshots are effectively taking is our retention policy. So our retention policy is how long we want to keep these snapshots. And for the most part, how much space these snapshots will take up is dictated by the oldest snapshot you've got. That's because if a file was referenced in a snapshot, it will not be removed from disk and you will not get your space back until that snapshot expires, till the last snapshot referencing that file is deleted. And the NAS automatically does that. And all we have to do is we tell the NAS how long we want to keep the files for. So if we come over here, I almost always enable an advanced retention policy. And what I normally do is I keep that hourly granularity that we've got for the past 14 days. That tends to be a good amount of time where if it's over 2 weeks old, you probably don't need hourly granularity anymore. Then after that, we've got to make our decisions for how long we want to keep files for. And for a video production house, going in and out of files all the time, maybe you say, I would for sure know if something happened within 7 days, and you only keep that. But for the most part, 14 days for hourly snapshots is great. And then how long we want to keep the dailies for. For most people, I recommend anywhere between 30 days and a year, depending on how much space you're using. If you're an accounting firm using next to no space, honestly, keep them for 5 years. But if you're somebody who is a photographer, constantly adding in files, deleting files, and going through space, this is what's going to dictate how much space these snapshots take up. If we set this to 30 days, and I was to delete a 10 gigabyte file today, that snapshot would reference that file for 30 days. So that 10 gigabyte file would not actually be removed from disk for 30 days. But on the flip side for ransomware, if the ransomware happened less than 30 days ago, I can roll back to exactly as it was and even just view exactly as it was at that previous time. So this right here is really where you kind of want to play with it and figure out what works for you. 90 days is awesome if you can manage a space. And then after you do 90 days, then I normally will switch to like weeklies for 52 weeks or something like that. You can play with these settings to really keep however long you'd like it, not just for ransomware, but also just for, hey, what were we doing back then? Why is that file gone? And kind of getting a history of your files. When you're thinking about how much space these are going to take up, look at whatever the longest version of this is going to be. And that's the one that is going to be controlling how much space these are taking up. So for me, on this one, I would not get my space back from that 10 gigabyte file for an entire year. All right, so for basic ransomware protection, let's do 60 days. That is long enough where you probably have noticed anything happening on the NAS. And so we're going to go ahead and set that, but obviously choose whatever makes sense to you. Now, the last thing we're going to go ahead and do that's just very useful to making sure that we can go ahead and easily see what's going on and just make it more useful is we are going to make the snapshots visible. All right, So we just did a whole bunch of stuff, and I'm going to take a manual snapshot here. Let's talk about what would happen now if this NAS got ransomwared. Let's say that my computer right here starts encrypting a bunch of files on the NAS. And this is the power of snapshots. So this could be through Windows File Explorer, macOS Finder, Synology Drive, or just right here. We're going to do it right on the NAS right here. So I'm going to go ahead and compress all of these. And we add a file. This is basically what ransomware does. And not so beautiful of a setup, it would essentially just encrypt all of your files, and every single file would just be encrypted just like that. So that is how ransomware works. In reality, it's a little bit more sophisticated. It's a script that's running in the background so you don't really notice. And instead of doing it all in one folder, it does it file by file. But essentially what you would have is you would open up the file system one day and you'd see all your files in a weird extension, and then you'd see a file that says, read me to get your files back. What that would instruct you to do is to send Bitcoin to some address to get your files back. And this is where we can actually undo all of this without having to do anything too difficult because we've got these snapshots. There are two different ways we could recover from this. One, because we made these snapshots visible, we can actually just open up this snapshot folder. And as I said earlier, I had already taken some snapshots of this. And we can literally just open it up and see exactly what all the files look like when that snapshot was taken. And by the way, if you look, these are read-only. So the crypto virus is not going to be able to encrypt snapshots because snapshots are read-only. So it would be able to see that they exist, but it wouldn't be able to do anything about them. So we have two ways of restoring. We could either just copy out of the past and paste it back in right here. And that is useful for anything other than ransomware. If somebody saves over that Word document, you can just, through Windows File Explorer, macOS Finder, open up the file, copy the contents out that you want, and paste it back in. It is absolutely awesome. But now let's talk about how we would handle actual ransomware. Well, what we would do is we log back into the NAS and we come into the Snapshot Replication tab and go into a recovery menu right here. We would then select all the folders that were affected and hit recover. And this is where it actually allows us to either browse it, clone it to a new name, so that's useful if you want to kind of be very selective and kind of see what happened, or in most cases, restore to this snapshot. What this will do is this will just roll back the clock. This will literally bring that folder exactly as it was to the time of that snapshot. And this is a great way of getting back up and running within minutes. This restore process for 100 terabyte volume will be under 30 seconds. That's because it doesn't have to move any files around. The files are all there. They're already there. All it has to do is reset up where it looks for them. It's incredibly fast and incredibly useful. And if you look right here, it's got this take a snapshot before restoring. This means that you have the ability to kind of like look back and say, well, somebody worked on this one file after we rolled it back that time, and still have that history there, which I would always check in almost all cases, because this allows you to kind of later on figure out what happened and grab anything you need. So this would be a non-destructive action. But I'm going to do it. And we can see right here, it's exactly as it was a few minutes ago, just like that. And that is how easy fixing this ransomware is. All right, so that is the process of restoring your files after ransomware. It is just that easy. You can see we did not have to go to backups or anything like that. And we were able to get back up and running in seconds. It is incredibly useful for all of that and just really easy to use and implement. And for the most part, you're going to forget about it until you need it and then it's there. I get a ton of questions on these videos about, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? And so I want to answer those really quickly here. And by far the most common one, other than how much space snapshots are taking up, as you notice, I mentioned it many times in this video, but by far the most common one is, well, one, there's the snapshot directory. They will just encrypt that. As I said, they're read-only. But two, it's the space usage during a ransomware attack. So the question often is, let's say I've got 90% space usage on my NAS and the ransomware starts. Well, how is it going to be able to store a full copy of the encrypted files and a full copy of the unencrypted files on 90% of the space? That would take up an extra 80% of the overall NAS space. That should not happen. And people are often concerned that the NAS would then start deleting snapshots. And that is actually not true. So in the case of ransomware, really it's as if they added in new files into the file system. So every time they encrypt a file, the space usage on the NAS would actually go up a little bit every single time. That's because now the NAS is storing the previous version and the current version of the file, that encrypted version. What will happen is the NAS is just going to fill up to 100% or whatever disk capacity you set it to, and then the script's going to stop because the NAS will say, sorry, you can't edit anything, the NAS is full. So there's nothing to worry about with that. It's not like the NAS goes, oh no, it's full, I'm going to start deleting snapshots. It just simply stops and says, sorry, you can't add any more files, we are full. That's the most common question I get. Really, this setup does not have an easy way around it for an attacker, and the only way around it is to actually get the NAS itself to delete the snapshots. And so that is where those immutable snapshots come in. So if you look, the difference between immutable snapshots and regular snapshots, they don't take up any different space, but the difference comes down to what you're allowed to do. So right here, I've listed out all the snapshots, and we can see this one's locked. That means it's not going to expire on its own. That's the one that was automatically taken before I rolled back. But because none of these are immutable, I can click on all of them and remove them. So even though they are not set to expire just yet, I was able to manually tell the NAS, hey, go ahead, have those reset. But let's go ahead and I'm going to take a snapshot on the S drive, but I'm going to make it immutable. And I'll show you that you are not going to be able to modify it at all. So when we come back in here and do the exact same thing, you can see that these are some immutable snapshots I had from a really long time ago. The NAS does not stay on, so that's why they've not expired yet. But I am not able to remove it. I can remove all the non-immutable ones, but I cannot remove this one at all. And the edit button only will allow me to rename it. So there's this system clock that prevents you as the administrator from being able to delete these snapshots. Now, as I said, that is the double-edged sword. It's great because now you know that no matter what happens, even if your account gets compromised, they will not be able to delete the snapshots for that set amount of time. But on the flip side, that recovery operation I talked about, if we were 100% full, you would not be able to delete those other snapshots until that clock expired. Or in the case where somebody adds too many files, you can't just get your space back automatically. So it truly is a double-edged sword, and it's just use case dependent. For an Office file server using 1/10 of the NAS's space, absolutely immutable snapshots are great once you're all set up. But definitely make sure you're all set up and you understand your storage requirements before just enabling immutable snapshots willy-nilly, because they are immutable. One other thing I do like to recommend to do is if you're setting up a 3-2-1 backup solution where you've got 2 on-site NASs, what I really like to do is set up immutable snapshots on the replication target. And that's an easy setting when you're setting up the replication job. That way, the primary file server does not have immutable snapshots on it. But when they're sent to the secondary on-site server, that's for failover, they are immutable over there. That gets you kind of the best of both worlds. So if anything crazy ever happens, you can get your space back and you get back up and running on the primary file server because they're not immutable there. But then if your DSM account is hacked, you know that you still have that copy on the secondary that has the immutability that cannot be touched. So it's a really great way of balancing in between, especially if you're something like a video production house where it's possible that all of a sudden it would get filled up and you need to be able to clear off space. All right, so that was my whole section on how snapshots can protect you if you're using the NAS as an Office file server. But let's talk about how it can protect you if you're not. Let's talk about how it can protect you if you are using it to back up other things, and you want to make sure that if your Google Drive gets attacked, if your Dropbox gets attacked, if your Windows domain controller gets attacked, that you all have a backup solution for that. And it's the exact same thing with just slightly different settings. If you noticed while I was running that, I'm actually cloud syncing this Joshua tree to the NAS. So that meant when I was changing all those things, it was uploading and downloading pieces. So the reason that that is useful is, say you want to make sure you can protect your Dropbox account from Dropbox screwing up, ransomware, whatever. What you can do is you just simply cloud sync it, do a full sync to the NAS. Then you take snapshots of that folder. Now, even if Dropbox deletes all your files, gets encrypted, whatever, even though that the NAS will follow the lead of the Dropbox and the primary copy of the files will be encrypted, will be deleted, whatever, you will still have the exact same snapshots and the ability to roll them back. So it's essentially like adding independent versioning of Dropbox. And then Active Backup for Business can be used to back up a Windows domain controller, or if you're just using something like a simple rsync job, the exact same settings apply, where you've got separate versioning outside of that. Now, if you are using something that has its own versioning, so Active Backup for Business, Time Machine, Hybrid Backup, things like that, that keep their own versioning, I want to show you the settings I generally will do for that. Because if something has its own versioning, we don't really want to take up too many extra versions, because now the space used can be significantly higher than it needs to be. So let's say I was sending a full backup of my files through Hyper Backup to this management folder, and Hyper Backup has 30 days of versions or whatever we set it to. Well, I still want to make sure that if the NAS that's sending the backups over gets compromised, we still want to make sure that we can recover no matter what, right? So that's where having independent snapshots on the backup system allow you to do that. So essentially what this will do is, even if the primary NAS that's backing itself up to our NAS says delete all the backups, this NAS here will say, sounds good, and it will. But you'll be able to roll back with the snapshots. But we don't want to take up tons of them because now our space is going to be a little bit less efficient. So what we'll do is maybe we'll take one on the weekends and maybe once per week. So we'll do every day on Sunday at 6 a.m. Now what we can do is we can keep a pretty lenient rule. Maybe we keep the last 5 weeks of snapshots. This would mean that you would have 5 weeks if the NAS itself deleted all of the backups to recover that. And it shouldn't take up too much space. In general, 3 is probably more than enough, but it's really up to you on how much space you're using, everything like that. And you can use immutable snapshots there as well. Similar principles apply for Active Backup for Business, and you can sprinkle in your immutable snapshots to all of those as well. Whew. Okay, so I think that fully covers using snapshots to prevent ransomware on your NAS and just on all your devices. You still need a backup, but this is a great place to make sure you don't have to go to your backup in the vast majority of cases. I set this up for clients all the time. If you're looking to hire me, there's a link for that down in the description below. But put your questions down in the comments below as well. And have a good one. Bye.